Hello everyone and welcome back to Pass the Aux Chord, and recently we saw the release of the final Weeknd album, at least the final album under that pseudonym for Abel Tesfaye. That of course being Hurry Up Tomorrow, so I thought what better time than the present to go back through the entire discography front to back, rank each one tier list style. I've been a fan for quite some time now, so it's a little bit bittersweet to see the end of an era like this, but I love how well everything has come together as a whole piece like it does. This is going to be a really cool thing to look through. And to kick things off, we're going to go with the infamous, legendary, well-known, and beloved debut. That, of course, being an EP called Inside the Dangerously Empty Lives of Teenage Girls. So I had no idea that this really even was a thing before recording this, but apparently this is an EP that came before House of Balloons, but it's debated on whether or not it's even like really an official thing. It's currently not up anywhere but Bandcamp. You can't find this on any major streaming platforms, but I'm not entirely sure that it's official on there because you just have The Weeknd spelled with the E like the traditional spelling of the word rather than the stylized without the E that we're all used to. Whether this is an official thing or not is not to my knowledge. What I do know is that there's not a whole lot of point to it because you have 3 tracks, them all being original versions of these songs, those being Loft Music, What You Need, and The Morning, and all of those landed on House of Balloons in at least equal quality, sometimes better quality than they are here. This original version of The Morning is so weird to listen to, with that being one of his most legendary tracks, at least as far as I'm concerned.
But behind closed doors they get pulled so rigid. All that money is a motive. All that money is a motive.
It's so strange to imagine the butterfly effect that it might have if that was the version that actually got sent out as the official product, because it sounds fucked. With that being maybe the biggest song of the trilogy era, I just can't help but imagine how that would have looked. The other 2 on here, Loft Music, What You Need, I heard that What You Need was an unofficial remix, and I'm not really quite sure how that would make this exist in 2010 before the release of House of Balloons even ever happened, but it's a thing, I guess. I'm honestly not even going to bother with an F tier with how consistent of a discography this is, so we're gonna slide it in a D. I almost wanna put it in an F because the title is so terrible and the completely blank white square album cover is unfortunately reminding me at the moment of a certain individual who made Graduation. Moving on from that, we have the actual legendary debut, as most people would recognize it, that being, of course, the mixtape House of Balloons. The first of the trilogy and arguably the best of the 3. I can't really even begin to guess how many times I have listened to this mixtape front to back throughout the years. You have so many hard-hitting songs that are memorable, long-lasting. This mixtape, this project just has such a great life to it. There's an atmosphere here that really embodied that mysterious aura of The Weeknd originally, when his identity was completely unknown and this was just someone who popped up on the internet, basically. It sounds that way. It's very cloudy and mysterious and still has that poppy edge though. Like we were saying with The Morning before, there are some iconic tracks that still just hold up and you can play in any setting whatsoever, if not most of the album being that way. Of course, it also starts this persona with lyrical topics that would become familiar, but not really leaning into a more emotional side of things ever, being pretty straightforward with things. It's very much so playing up this character, and it's party music that wants to be party music, as the whole title, aesthetic, so on and so forth would imply. I've always appreciated the fact that even the longer songs on this album are absolutely worth listening to and some of the best that it has to offer. House of Balloons / Glass Table Girls is one of the best songs he's ever made. I would say that about The Party and the After Party, as well as Loft Music, all of those being some of the longest songs on the album. This thing's fantastic. It's great that we didn't end up with, The Morning as we saw it on the EP that came before this one. It's pretty arguable and a pretty well-received take that this is a perfect 10, and I'm not really sure where I would sit on that if I listened to it right now, but it's an easy S tier, and it's probably the one that I'll have the most to say about. Next up, we have the second in the trilogy, that being Thursday. It kind of feels like the House of Balloons' less successful younger brother to me, and it kind of always has. That's not to say that by any means this is a bad project. We're still in like 8 out of 10, 7 out of 10, that sort of range type territory. Life of the Party to me, and the way the hook almost feels like some sort of a rock type approach, is one of the more iconic tracks from the entire trilogy era, if you are to ask me. Of course, we see the first Drake feature on this album as well, which isn't really as good of a thing as it once was, perhaps, but at the time, it's pretty crazy looking at it, because 2 projects in, getting a feature from one of the biggest artists out is pretty crazy, and that is something that more than likely greatly contributed to his massive success that he ended up seeing throughout his entire career. Of course, you have The Birds Part 1 and 2 on here, also kind of a little legendary run there. The deeper cuts on here I don't so much care for or come back to. Rolling Stone, however, is a great one, but I think the other half or so of this album that I haven't mentioned is a little bit lower of a tier than a lot of what came on this entire trilogy era. I think it's fair to slide this one into a good B tier, some of it being lifted up by it kind of being step forward into fame and popularity, and it just being a little bit of a moment, the next step elaborating on what House of Balloons had already set up. Next up here we have Echoes of Silence. I go back and forth constantly between whether House of Balloons or Echoes of Silence is my favorite of the trilogy. Every song on this is pretty amazing. Opens up with a Michael Jackson cover that really takes some creative liberties, but also sets up the comparison that is often made of The Weeknd being this generation's Michael Jackson. Great cover. Ended up being one of my favorite things I was hearing when I first listened through the trilogy. EXO / The Host is a little bit of a deeper cut and kind of a weird one for him. I want to say this is one of the more experimental and definitely one of the most intense tracks of the early era here. Definitely not going for something more relaxed like most of House of Balloons, for example. Initiation follows it up and kind of does the same thing with it, and maybe those attributes can even be said to a higher extent with that one. And then following right after that, you have kind of a crazy little Juicy J feature. Again, getting a somewhat big name placement pretty early on in the career, even if Juicy J doesn't really have the cultural pull that he once did, perhaps. But The Fall and the title track are also iconic for this era, and really the deeper cuts that I didn't mention, or I guess they're not even necessarily deeper cuts, but once I didn't mention, I don't come back to quite as much. I think this is a little bit less consistent of a project than House of Balloons as a whole, but I think that the highest moments on it bring it up to the same level. This is another S tier to me. Following that up, we have the first album rather than mixtape, that being Kissland, and if I were to describe the discourse online around this album, I would describe this as The Weeknd's Cherry Bomb compared to Tyler the Creator, even though this album did, I want to say, come before it. But the way these are looked at is kind of in a similar light. Either you are the biggest fan of Kissland or you are the biggest hater. Personally, I've tried to get it so many times throughout the years. With this having the biggest dark wave influence, I would predict that it would be my favorite if I had never heard these before. I even really like the way that era is stylized. Just looking at this cover is really cool to me. It's got kind of a different thing despite sounding a little bit like the trilogy still, but no matter how many times I listen to this album, no matter how many times throughout the years I come back to it and being like, yeah, this is the time that I'm gonna get Kissland and fully understand what the die-hard fans of it are talking about. Just doesn't entirely do it for me. I find this to be just one of his more bland and sleepy releases, all things considered, as hot of a take as that might be. However, when those darkwave influences really hit, this is like super solid. There's great moments across it, don't get me wrong. If I were to pick some favorites, I like the title track, The Town, Adaptation, and even Tears in the Rain is a pretty solid closer. But if you listen to more than one of those songs back to back, it does become a bit fatiguing. This is a 55-minute long album, and I know that long albums are to be expected when exploring this discography, but this one feels the longest to me despite not being even close to the longest album. Personally, I have to give it a C. If you hate me for that, that's understandable. I wish I could get it too. Next up here, we have the sophomore album, Beauty Behind the Madness. If this isn't an iconic cover art right here, I don't know what is. If you grew up at the same time as me, or thereabouts, if you're a Gen Z kid here, you grew up with this everywhere. Often, The Hills, of course, Can't Feel My Face, and Earned It, even Real Life, and Tell Your Friends to an extent. So many hits on here, just a hit parade of an album, and it's likely going to be one that's so like well respected and well renowned in the future. Think your pop albums like Purple Rain, for example, where everybody just has the vinyl for some reason and it's just always there, even if you listen to it or don't. It's going to be one that people listen to forever, and those hits are hitting. The Hills is right up there in my favorite Weeknd songs, even though that's a pretty basic take. That one has the most edge to it to me, or maybe it's just a little bit louder than a lot of the other songs on here that take a much more relaxed approach, so I'm kind of just prone to liking it a little bit more out of the hits here. Personally, I'm not a big fan of Earned It because it essentially does the opposite to that, but Often, for example, again, is absolutely iconic. I do think what people end up forgetting that are big fans of Beauty Behind the Madness, though, is the deeper cuts that just don't hit. Losers with Labyrinth is like fine, but I don't really want to hear it that much when I'm listening to the whole album. A little bit tacky, perhaps. And another collab that lands on here is unfortunately with Ed Sheeran. I mean, what can you say about Ed Sheeran at this point? Hating on him is basically just flayed out, and I don't hate Ed Sheeran. Not entirely. He's made some great songs over the years, some absolute hits. But do I want to see an Ed Sheeran feature on anything? Probably not. I believe this is also the first collaboration with Lana Del Rey on Prisoner, which ends up being the best of the deep cuts as far as I'm concerned. But again, we have kind of a long runtime, this time being even longer at 10 more minutes, which makes sense because there's 14 tracks on here, which is more than Kissland. So many of the most iconic songs of an entire generation on here. The deep cuts don't do it as many favors. It feels blasphemous to everyone my age to rate it lower than an A, and I'm debating if I want to anyways. I won't though, just because if nothing else, this is the album that brought us a song about cocaine that won the Nickelodeon Kids Award or whatever. Next up here, it's not gonna get any less iconic, okay? We started with Beauty Behind the Madness, and it's all just from here on out, just legendary stuff. But Starboy is less good of an album, don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that as a whole, like, look at this track list and then be like, oh yeah, that's what happened here. This was a whole thing. Starboy being basically a perfect song if you were to look at it on like a numbers and objective level. I don't think that's a hot take whatsoever. If it is, and you have a different take, go for it. Honestly, let me know. If you have different takes than any of these, let me know in the comments, because I'm sure I'm gonna ruffle some feathers with this. But again, one of the most memorable and iconic and well-liked and widely listened to pop songs of my lifetime is Starboy, and that opens up this album. I like the deeper cuts on this more than I do on Beauty Behind the Madness as a general rule, although there's some that I never come back to. Party Monster I think actually ends up being my favorite, and False Alarm right after it, also fantastic to me. We see another Lana Del Rey collaboration here, this time on an interlude, and that's immediately followed up with a Kendrick Lamar collaboration. This album has the rare and elusive Kendrick Lamar feature, which is of course, really cool. This was at an earlier time in Kendrick's career where he was collaborating with more pop stars and the like to get some big hitters, get a little bit more well-renowned. 2016 was a little bit of a different time where that wasn't quite so expected, but in the long run, it's really interesting to see his name on a track list. And I think Sidewalks as a whole, the song that he's on, is pretty great. You also get Future and of course Daft Punk bookending the album, featured on both tracks. Other highlights across this thing, I want to say A Lonely Night is a great one. Die For You is even better than that. I'm a fan of Rockin'. I don't know if a lot of people are as big of a fan of it. And Even Secrets is pretty cool. Now, that being said, anything I didn't mention is basically bloat. However, the bloat is shorter. This album is 18 tracks and only an hour and 8 minutes, whereas the last one is 14 tracks and manages to be only 3 minutes less. The songs that are underwhelming here are pretty in one ear and out the other and doesn't leave a lasting impression, positive or negative, which almost makes me like the album a little bit more when looked at as a whole piece. However, it just doesn't have the big hits like Beauty Behind the Madness does all the way across it. It's mostly the one song, if we're being real. I think this can slide easily into a B tier. Again, it's one that I would consider putting a tier lower, but we'll go with B for sure. That then concludes what is basically the 3-album first trilogy. I'm not sure if there's really like a name for that, but it is a trilogy of trilogies. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but those 3 albums are one run, and then we get bookending it and kind of a separation or an interlude, I don't know how you want to look at it, with the EP here. My Dear Melancholy is the only EP he ever really did as The Weeknd, if we're not counting that weird little 3-track, whatever the fuck it is, thing right at the beginning. And you have 6 tracks across it. All of them good. I don't think there's a lot here that I can call amazing though. If there was, it would be Call Out My Name, and that one feels right at home on Beauty Behind the Madness if it was on there, as well as really the rest of the album. It kind of sounds like that era. It is very much so a pairing of that album with Starboy, because you get a little bit more of that synth pop stuff going on, a little bit more higher energy. 2 collaborations with Josephine here, but you also have Skrillex and Mike Will Made It on production here, which are a strange collaboration of names working all together to bring us this one. But all things considered, I don't come back to this EP because A, it doesn't really feel like a cohesive and nicely wrapped together project if we are to run it front to back, and B, it doesn't really have songs that stand out as memorable to me. The vinyl pressing with an etched second side is really cool though. I have to give it that. And honestly, even the album cover in general is pretty cool. But then that's gonna move us on to the modern era, the most recent trilogy, the Divine Trilogy, whatever you choose to call it. Starting off with After Hours, of course. After Hours is going to be a lot of people's favorites, and that is not without reason. I can totally understand why it would be. I don't think it's ever going to be my top number 1, but it's an amazing album and one that will stand the test of time. I was kind of saying this with another album before, but this is another that's going to just be a vinyl record that everybody has forever, and everybody knows this album from my generation, and it's just going to be one that's like played at parties or weddings or whatever forever. Blinding Lights is in particular the hit, and I want to say that it is potentially the biggest Weeknd hit ever. It was pretty much the pandemic pop anthem, if we're going to pick one out. It came out pre-pandemic by all means, but 2020 is when this album came out and had its biggest longest run, and Blinding Lights as a whole did the same thing. It kept being popular as the album came out, even when it was originally a pretty popular song. And it's easy to see why. It's got a little bit of a retro synth pop, kind of 80s type feel to it. It's throwing things back. It still sounds modern, however. It's a great balance of both nostalgia and modern fun, and even some very nice, very catchy, infectious, wonderful songwriting that you just gotta hear and just gotta respect. As a pop song of the modern era, it is one of the most legendary, and I've been saying that about a lot of songs already, so you know it's the case. I was surprised to see what songs ended up really popping off later on as the album got a little bit older and people got more acquainted with it. I know Hardest to Love had some really big hit potential right from the beginning, but it always kind of felt like a less effective version to an extent of what Blinding Lights was already doing, but it's still an amazing song and it had its run for sure. But Save Your Tears, going a little bit more of a new wave type direction even, if I could say, is the other really big, really iconic hit from this, and it wasn't necessarily the case when the album came out. That one's got longevity, and it's going to remain having longevity, I think. But there's nothing bad on this album whatsoever. There are no misses. You can play this front to back, and there's not really any skips. I think that some tracks are produced worse than others, but even the deeper cuts on here, Snow Child ends up being one of his most emotionally dense songs. Escape from LA, I would say the same for, and it even ties in really nicely narrative-wise. And we'll see that popping up once again when Take Me Back to LA landed on the most recent project. There's a running theme that was established there, and that's very cool. However, I cannot conclude this discussion without mentioning Heartless. Produced by Metro Boomin, of course, and I would argue possibly even better than Blinding Lights. This is the song that got me into The Weeknd. Like, obviously I knew multiple songs because they were inescapable through so much of my life, but Heartless wasn't even necessarily one of those. Don't get me wrong, it did numbers. It was the B-side to Blinding Lights, depending on how you look at it. It did come out after, however. It came out around the same time, and it was the first single, and it established this character, the throwback looking character, the very LA looking character that he did throughout this entire album cycle. I was immediately enamored with the aesthetic of it and just how much of a banger Heartless is. One of his catchiest tracks in my opinion, and one that I have come back to numerous. Also, really crazy how there's no credited features on this. This was a solo Weeknd album, nothing else to say. Really felt like a consistent and cohesive piece of art rather than trying to necessarily pull hits together. It is one that runs front to back flawlessly and feels like it's meant to be listened to as such. Easy S tier, I mean, what do we gotta say? Next up, what we're pulling out is one of the stranger albums in The Weeknd's entire career, that being Dawn FM. Out of anything he ever released, probably the biggest one you can call a concept album, even though it's directly tying into the storyline, kind of the trilogy that was set up with After Hours. You've got these radio skits that come on, and the whole death and afterlife theme of the album is very much so pushed to the forefront with this one. It is an incredibly artful piece that follows up After Hours very well, in my opinion. I really like almost everything about Dawn FM, and it is one that further solidified that I would remain a really big fan, even though After Hours did enough on its own. I love the diversity that's introduced on this. We still have plenty of throwback type sounds and plenty of modern sounds mixed in, but this one just feels different. This one's off to the side in the career. It's not necessarily a footnote, but it's not one of his most popular albums, maybe the least successful of at least anything since Beauty Behind the Madness. However, if you're a fan, if you're really digging in, I think there's nothing you can really complain about here. Of course, however, it has its flaws. If you're not into the concept, then tracks like A Tale by Quincy, as well as Every Angel is Terrifying, or maybe even the intro track, aren't really going to do anything for you. I love the concept personally. I listened to this album front to back numerous times just because the meta thing going on with it is very appealing to me and I appreciate it a lot. However, if what you're coming to this album for is more just a collection of songs that are going to be fun, catchy pop songs, you might not be as pleased with what you end up finding. Gasoline is maybe the most unique song from anything that he ever made, set apart and compared to the other tracks. I mean, you can always see the progression from one track to the next and be like, oh yeah, that's how we got here. You know, different influences influenced different eras. But if you listen to The Morning, and then you listen to Can't Feel My Face, and then you listen to Blinding Lights, it's a logical progression. Gasoline being the first actual song on this album sets it up for something pretty fucking crazy, pretty different for his style. The vocal tone on this is way different than anything else you hear. It sounds like a totally different artist. Take My Breath, I want to say, might have been the biggest hit. It was definitely the lead single, and I remember that being pretty hype. It is maybe the most similar thing to After Hours on the whole album, so it makes a lot of sense that it just being kind of the follow-up to Blinding Lights that people would end up digging it quite a bit, and it's a great song. One of the strangest things about this album actually ends up being the features that landed on it. We have Tyler, the Creator, on Here We Go Again, and Lil Wayne on I Heard You're Married. I Heard You're Married is a decently strange concept for a song, and then the way it's all assembled and the way a Lil Wayne verse ends up popping in is just not what you'd expect. Here We Go Again just has a structure of title that you wouldn't necessarily expect from such a mainstream artist. I feel like just the ellipsis in there is like, there's something interesting about it. But then you have Tyler, the Creator, and that's another artist I've been a fan of for quite some time. I was just at his concert, and seeing that many people watching Tyler, the Creator, perform is kind of crazy, and all the theatrics of the stage show itself is really interesting to see. The blow up of popularity that happened with Igor is wild, and see him here featured on one of the biggest artists ever's album is kind of wild, and the way he slides into the song is a little bit less clunky than you would expect, although there is just not a lot of vocal chemistry between the two, especially considering that Tyler is doing a pretty straightforward rapping approach rather than, you know, the singing type stuff that he did on Igor. All things considered, I find Dawn FM to be an extremely interesting release among the discography. It's one of my favorites, but I can't call it perfect. There are little flaws throughout, and it's going to depend on the person how much you end up liking it. For that reason, I can only justify putting it an A. And that moves us on to the final album, Hurry Up Tomorrow. One of the craziest album cycles I've ever really had to witness. We had an officially announced release date for quite some time, ended up getting pushed back. We had a lead single, seemingly, with Dancing in the Flames that made a lot of sense. And then it was followed up by two that really didn't match it in style, those being Sao Paulo with Anita and, of course, Timeless with Cardi. Both of them pretty experimental tracks. Timeless kind of leaning into what Playboi Carti has usually done, and the other being one that dives into Brazilian funk a little bit. Has a pretty crazy chorus on it. It's 5 minutes long, and across it you never really know what to expect next. It's a pretty big, hard hitter, and one of the most controversially accepted ones of his entire career, I would bargain to say. Plenty of people love this one. I am among those people, but plenty of people don't really like the whole angle and influences that it took up. We got a crazy music video for that one in particular. During this release cycle, Timeless ended up being a pretty big hit. Not totally inescapable by any means, but I ended up hearing it like in public and stuff, and Didn't ever really expect it to be a Weeknd song that would blow up like that, just because it feels a bit experimental for him, and the Cardi verse in particular feels a little bit off the beaten path, and unfortunately it's probably AI, which sucks and just brings this whole album down a little bit, so I just ignore that was ever a thing. But then this album got delayed right before its release. It was going to drop on the same week as FKA Twigs, which was going to be a really crazy release night, but at least we had another bigger pop album to satiate that week's releases. And the reason it actually got delayed was because of the California wildfires that are going on, unfortunately, right now. And what's really interesting as a little moment in time is the fact that Dancing in the Flames, the lead single, just so happens to not be on the album. I mean, really, there could be a variety of reasons for this. Aesthetically, it didn't have the mask thing kind of going on that the other two singles did. It sounded a lot more like something on After Hours or Dawn FM than something that would fit on this album. There's a decent chance it was never planned to be on the album. However, it might have just been that the wildfires are happening and that title would have seemed tasteless. A real New York City Cops by the Strokes moment. But the album doesn't even need it. We've got so many songs here. This is the longest Weeknd album, I do believe. Yeah, we're looking at a whole 22 tracks counting interludes and a whole 84 minutes of runtime, and despite that, doesn't even come close to feeling like his longest album to me. This is starting and then done, and at no time am I bored. I like every song on Hurry Up Tomorrow, and is it recency bias? Maybe. I'll give you a maybe. However, I don't think so. This is the grand finale that we needed. Things that get delayed, things that get pushed back forever, end up not meeting expectations more oftentimes than not. Whether it be music, whether it be movies, games, any media really. When stuff's delayed, usually that means there is problems with the product, but sooner or later, those delays are going to just cause an unfinished product to come out. That's not the case. This is like over finished, if anything. There's 22 songs here. It flows together perfectly. There's nothing about this that feels rushed. It's also rare for you to see an album run this long and have this many songs without anything truly feeling like filler. But if I were to try to pick out a song on here that I think is totally filler, I don't think I would be able to find one. There's not really any that I can think of. Wake Me Up has Justice featured on it, which is such a cool little shout there. Love Justice, loved their last album, and it's an amazing opener, such a great way to start the album. And then it's followed up by what I will predict to be the next Blinding Lights, being Cry For Me. Already performed this one at the Grammys. I want to say it's been released as a single, but immediately when I heard this album, I'm like, that's the hit. That's the hit across this whole thing. If you told me Baptized in Fear is his best song, I would have no complaints with that. I've listened to this song numerous times, and it might be my favorite thing. It's got narrative structure, which is super cool. It manages to have a catchy, definitive, standout chorus while still being ominous in a way. It's just not often you see a storytelling song despite these three albums really having a narrative, so it was pretty cool that it happened. Going across the rest of this album, Reflections Laughing is crazy. One of his more experimental tracks, and seeing a feature list of Florence and the Machine and Travis Scott on the same song is insane. Enjoy the Show with Future feels like a Weeknd and Future banger that's going to do numbers. Not really a banger, you know. Maybe that's not the right word for it. It's a pretty relaxed track, and I love it thematically. I love what it does for the album, but I do think it'll be a hit. And Niagara Falls, I'm not sure if it is going to be a huge hit, but if not, it's the sleeper hit, it's the fan favorite, it's the one that's going to prove the test of time. Maybe the best sampling and production we've seen from this entire era. Love the way this song sounds. And then Take Me Back to LA, already mentioned that ties back in all the way back to After Hours, kind of making this whole looped trilogy make a little more sense. And I feel like in the later leg of this album, you just have so many crazy moments that are something that I don't feel like he ever would have really attempted earlier on in his career, because for one reason or another, you just wouldn't do that. If you're trying to make big pop songs, you don't necessarily make a song like Big Sleep, or even The Abyss, which shows another Lana Del Rey collaboration happening. Red Terror, I was shocked to see got a music video, because it does feel like a deep cut to me. But it is also the start of what I would call just kind of the grand finale of the grand finale. This last 3-track run is perfect, dude. It's amazing. And I love that the last song loops all the way back in to the opening track of House of Balloons. That is so cool. And that means that we have a wrapped up trilogy of trilogies. It is perfect. It is so satisfying to my little brain. The only thing that sucks is that he was doing something where each pose was mirroring the last, okay? I mean, I'll show it on screen so that I don't sound like a crazy person, and then I'll cover up, right now, I'll do it, I'll cover up the new album cover that kind of looks like a movie poster with the old album cover, the one that we saw during the entire promotion and lead up, which was an album that people had their critiques with, but it mirrored it. It made it a perfect mirror of the other trilogy, and that's gone now. But original pressings still have it. It has still been put out there in the world to some official capacity. I'll take it. It's just a little less satisfying to look at on like streaming platforms and stuff, because it doesn't match up perfectly anymore, and I hate that. And I wish people would have just liked the original cover, because he probably would have kept it. But this one does match what is yet to come, that being a Hurry Up Tomorrow movie, which, given the idol, could go one of two ways, but the trailer looks neat. So hopefully it goes in the positive direction. I have no idea if that's getting a theatrical release or it's just going straight onto streaming, but I will be there one way or the other. I feel like if that movie ends up being good, this will just further cement that this is the perfect closing off of things. I don't know if it quite dips into that S tier for me. I feel like some recency bias, I have to give room for it. So I'm gonna go ahead and go with an A on this. I think there are deep cuts that are less good than the main songs, if that makes any sense. So yeah, that closes everything off. He's going on a tour right now with Cardi, and you know, it's debatable if Cardi's gonna show up to anything, but that's the idea, is that he's going on tour with Cardi. And it's crazy seeing how things are just closing up, and I really have to wonder what is next. What is the plan going forward? Because this is the end of the Weeknd pseudonym. We're here. It's over, it's finished, but it's coming to a very satisfying closing, and I couldn't be more happy with Hurry Up Tomorrow. Well, technically I could, I guess, but it's amazing. It's such a great grand finale, and I love it. But I'm sure that I had plenty of takes that people disagree with in this video. If that's the case, let me know what your takes are in the comment section down below. It would be greatly appreciated if you could drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music related content coming your way. You can turn notifications on for that same thing as well, and I will see you in the next video.